Hey pals, it's me Matt. I am here with a different style video than what I've been doing recently, where I've just been telling you about new releases that come out every Friday. I figured I would talk about something else. It's a show that I did on my radio program that I do once a week here in Kansas City on 90.1 FM KKFI Kansas City Community Radio, and my show, like the title of this channel, is also called Music for Your Peers. The show that I did most recently, last Friday, was all about power pop. I've been kind of in a kick now for a little while, last couple months, and so I worked pretty hard on this show, and I figured I would just let you guys know about it if you're interested in checking out the show or checking out the music. This video won't be like a comprehensive history of the genre or the bands, but I'll just give you some background, and if you're interested, you can check out the show on the KKFI 2-week archive, and if you're watching this video far further in the future, I will figure out a way that I can get you a recording of it. However, so let's talk about power pops. And, at some point in the late 1960s, the term power pop was created because The Who described themselves that way. And the genre really is, the bands that play power pop music it's really just rock and roll. It's rock and roll, but in the late 60s and in the 70s, you had this sort of divide starting to form among rock and roll bands, where you had a lot of the bands pushing the boundaries, going a little bit harder, the singing getting a little bit, a little bit more guttural, a little more, rock sounding. You can think of like Led Zeppelin as being like a pretty, earmark example of this. But then you had some bands that wanted to, kind of, put the distortion of the guitars, maybe have a little bit more of a hard rocking vibe, but keep those clean vocals, and in most cases, like clean multi-part harmonies. When power pop really started to become a genre in the 1970s, you had bands like Big Star, who is one of the better known cult followed bands of the genre, and they were making music just like this, where they would have the clean vocals, the multi-part harmony, but they had the distorted guitars, beefed up rhythm section. Another band from the time that was decently well known was Shoes. This album is called Present Tense. They also had an album that I like a little bit more than this. I think it maybe has a little bit more of that sound, that power pop sound, is called Black Vinyl Shoes. And then a little bit lesser known, at least here in the United States, maybe they had a little bit more of a following in Europe, but The Motors, here they are. They had their big hit was called Airport. Anyway, you had these bands who were all doing that sort of stuff. And unfortunately for the record labels and the movers and shakers in the industry, they did not have a good way of marketing these bands. So you had a lot of them, case in point being Big Star, who after they put out their first 2 records, pretty much had like no money to continue. And so they stopped being a band. The record label went ahead and they cobbled together some old studio sessions and some mostly finished tracks, and they just pushed out a 3rd album really without the band's input. And so the genre, I'm not going to say fully died out, but it started to really wane because there was not a ton of these bands around. There was no money to be made, unfortunately. And so in the later 70s and in the 80s, you had music really shifting towards like arena rock or glam rock, hair metal, in the 80s, thrash metal, so you were getting all these different harder genres. I should mention punk too. These guys, the power pop bands, weren't really punk bands. Very occasionally they would have a song that was like maybe a little bit more up tempo, but to be fair, they did not have the punk aesthetic at all. And so in the 90s, you had some bands sort of pick up the mantle. They were like, we're gonna continue on with this. So you had some bands like Dada. This was like a pretty well-known record in 1992. Guided by Voices, who in earnest did start in the 80s, and they're still around today, actually. I consider them to be power pop. That's maybe not their main genre. They're maybe more just like indie rock or whatever. But I think if you go back and listen, or like lo-fi rock, they still they have some influences of power pop in there. And of course, Robert Pollard, who was inspired by the Beatles and some of these other bands, so he has like that same DNA that the power pop bands did in the early 70s. A little bit lesser known, but still pretty cool. Ultra Vivid Scene. This was a neat record of theirs. Another band from that time period in the 90s, and then leading into the 2000s, was the Posies. You can see them here. And actually, members of the Posies joined up with Alex Chilton, who is the guy who started Big Star, later in the 90s to do some concerts with him. And then he reformed Big Star with those guys from the Posies. So that was pretty cool. So that kind of takes us into the early 2000s, and then from there, again, you had music shifting ever more. Pop music really started to solidify itself into the sound that we kind of know today in the 2000s. You can think of like Britney Spears, Backstreet Boys, groups like that. So you wouldn't consider those to be rock bands, right? So now there was this further delineation where you have rock music getting harder, you have pop music getting poppier, and so this power pop lane is a thin band of bands it's like a very niche sound at this point going forward. And then, in the 2010s, you had the rise of like alternative rock and indie rock. And so here again, the power pop kind of died out for better or for worse. But kind of part of the reason why I did this show is that very recently there have been several bands coming out with albums that I think all kind of fit into the power pop genre. The Tubs with Cotton Crown, as well as Star 99 with the album Simulator. Bad Bad Birds is another band. The Blusterfields with the album Peach. That's a brand new one as well. Yeah, so if you're interested, you can go to archive.kkfi.org, and then in the bar where it asks you like what show you want to search for, scroll down the list and you can find Music for Your Peers. I'm kind of right in the middle, and it'll show you the last two shows that I've recorded, and just click on the most recent one, which will have come out on April 25th. You can listen to it up until May 9th. That's the last day it'll be available on streaming. If you're interested in hearing the show, it's, like I said, it's Music for Your Peers. I go live every Friday from 3:30 to 5 a.m. here in Kansas City on 90.1 FM, KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio, or you can stream online if you want to figure out what that time is in your neck of the woods. You can do that, and you can listen live on kkfi.org, or you can use the archive. So thanks so much. I'll see you later. I hope you liked this. Let me know if you listen to any of these bands, or if there was any tunes that you enjoyed, and I will catch you later. Bye-bye.